The morning Ida Collins picked up her broom for the first time with the intention of using it as a weapon rather than a cleaning tool. The sun had barely crested the ridge of the Cimarron Hills, and she was already angrier than she had been in months. It was the spring of 1883, and the dust of the Oklahoma Territory lay thick and amber across every surface of the small homestead she had carved out of the earth with her late husband, Thomas Collins, who had died 14 months prior of a fever that had swept through the territory like a quiet and merciless thief. Thomas had been a good man, not a perfect one, but a good one, and he had left Ida with 40 acres of hard-won land, a two-room house with a solid roof, a milk cow named Bess, 3 chickens, a mule named Clarence, and a daughter named June who had just turned 8 years old. What Thomas had not left her was easy circumstances. The land was productive when the rains cooperated, and Ida had managed to plant a winter wheat field the previous autumn that had come in reasonably well. She had sold enough grain to cover her taxes at the land office in Guthrie, and she had managed through the winter on dried beans, cornbread, and a stubbornness that her mother had always called a failing, and that Ida had quietly always considered her greatest asset. The first man came on a Tuesday. His name was Chet Barlow, and he rode in on a fine-looking roan horse that told Ida right away that whatever Chet Barlow had, he had not worked especially hard for it. He wore a bolo tie and a hat that had been shaped with more care than any hat had a right to expect, and he smiled at her with the particular smile of a man who had never once been told no by a woman and expected to continue that streak indefinitely. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," he said, swinging down from the roan with the practiced ease of a man who spent a great deal of time trying to look impressive. "I represent some interested parties from Kansas who have been making inquiries about land acquisition in this region, and your parcel has come to our attention." Ida was standing on the porch with a rag in her hand, having been in the middle of wiping down the window glass. June was inside at the kitchen table working on her letters. Bess was lowing softly from the small barn out back. "Not selling," Ida said. "Now, Mrs. Collins, I don't think you've heard the offer." "I don't need to hear it. The land isn't for sale. Good morning, Mr. Barlow." He launched into a speech about fair market value and the difficulties a woman alone faced in maintaining a working farm, and somewhere in the middle of that speech, while he was explaining to Ida what her own situation looked like as though she had not been living it for 14 months, Ida went inside, picked up her broom, came back out, and began sweeping the porch in the direction of his horse. "Mrs. Collins, She swept harder. The broom moved with considerable purpose toward the roan's feet, and the horse shuffled sideways, and Chet Barlow, who valued his hat and his dignity in roughly equal measure, found himself retreating toward the saddle with a speed that was not altogether dignified. "You'll regret this," he called from the end of the lane. "I regret a great many things," Ida called back pleasantly. "The fact that you came here is not among them." She went back to washing her windows. The second man came 3 weeks later, and he was different from Chet Barlow in the way that a rattlesnake is different from a copperhead. The species varied, but the venom was essentially the same. His name was Gerald Hicks, and he was the foreman of the Bar M Ranch, which was the large cattle operation that bordered Ida's property to the west. The Bar M had been trying to expand for 2 years, and Ida's 40 acres sat in a particularly inconvenient position between their main range and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her land. Gerald Hicks came not with a smile but with a slow, studied seriousness, the kind a man puts on when he wants to appear as though he is doing you a favor. "The Bar M is prepared to offer you a price that's more than generous, Mrs. Collins, more than you'd see from anyone else. You could take that money and buy yourself a comfortable situation somewhere more suitable." "More suitable," Ida repeated, "for a woman on her own, with a child." Ida looked at him for a long moment. There was a quality to her silences that men consistently underestimated. They tended to interpret a woman's quiet as uncertainty rather than as the controlled patience of someone choosing very carefully which words to use. "Mr. Hicks," she said finally, "this is my land. My husband and I filed the claim together. We broke this ground together. He is buried on the east corner of it, under a cottonwood tree that we planted the first spring we were here. My daughter plays near that tree. This land is not more suitable or less suitable. It is ours, and no amount of money from the Bar M is going to change that." Gerald Hicks had not expected this speech. He opened his mouth to respond. Ida went inside, got her broom, came back out, and this time she was not sweeping the porch. She was walking with the broom held at the ready like a woman who had thought very carefully about where she intended to deploy it. And something in her face, something in the absolute certainty of her brown eyes, and the set of her jaw, and the way she moved without hesitation, made Gerald Hicks step back. He was a big man, Gerald Hicks. He was broad across the shoulders and he wore a gun on his hip, and he had been moving cattle and men around the Oklahoma Territory for a decade. He was not afraid of Ida Collins. He was, however, suddenly and acutely aware of the fact that he would look extraordinarily foolish if a widow woman in a flour sack apron hit him with a broom in front of the open sky, and there was always the chance that someone might see. He left. Ida stood at the gate of her lane and watched him go, and when he had disappeared around the bend, she went back inside and set the broom against the wall and stood at the stove for a while, staring at the coffee pot, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from labor but from vigilance. "Mama," June said from the table where she was still working on her letters, "are you all right?" "I'm fine, baby," Ida said. "I'm just fine." She said it with enough conviction to satisfy a child. She was not entirely sure she satisfied herself. The third man came in early June, and he was the one who genuinely frightened her, though she did not show it. His name she never learned. He came on foot, which was unusual, and he came in the late afternoon when the light was long and golden, and the shadows stretched across the wheat field like dark fingers. He was a lean, quiet man with cold eyes, and the look of someone who had spent time in places where the law was more of a suggestion than a practice. He said he was looking to buy the land. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who had decided on an outcome, and was merely going through the motions of pretending that negotiation was possible. When Ida said no, he did not leave. He stood in her yard and looked at the house and then at her and then at the barn, slow and deliberate, like a man taking an inventory. "You're out here all alone," he said. "I am," Ida agreed. Her voice did not waver. Inside the house, June was napping. Inside Ida's chest, her heart was a hard, fast drum beat. "I am alone and I have a rifle and I know how to use it, and I am asking you to leave my property." The man looked at her for another long moment. Ida went inside very calmly, picked up not the broom this time but the Remington rolling block rifle that Thomas had taught her to shoot on their third year on the homestead, and she came back out with it. She did not point it at him. She did not need to. She simply carried it the way a woman carries a tool she is entirely comfortable with, and she said, "Now." He left. Ida went back inside and sat down on the floor of the kitchen with her back against the wall for a long time, the rifle across her knees, listening to June breathing in the next room. She sat there until her heartbeat settled and the light through the window had gone from gold to rose to the pale blue of early dusk, and then she got up and made supper. She told herself she was managing. She told herself she was fine. She was not entirely sure she believed it, but she was very sure that believing it was necessary, so she held onto it with both hands. 2 weeks after the third man left, a wagon came up the lane. It was a plain wagon, the kind used for hauling, pulled by 2 solid-looking draft horses that were well kept and showing it. There was a man on the bench, and when Ida came out onto the porch to see who was coming, she had the broom in her hand before she quite realized she had reached for it. The wagon stopped at the end of the lane where the fence post marked the beginning of her property, and the man on the bench did not come any further. He sat there for a moment, and then he did something that none of the other men had done. He got down from the wagon, not to come toward her. He stepped down onto the lane and he looked at her on the porch with her broom, and then he looked at the land around him. The wheat field which was doing well this year, the kitchen garden along the south side of the house, the small barn, the cottonwood tree in the east corner with the simple wooden marker beneath it. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he finds genuinely worth looking at. And then he sat down in the dust at the end of her lane with his back against the fence post, his hat resting on his knee, and he looked up at her and said, "Mrs. Collins, I expect I could use a drink of water if you're willing." Ida Collins stood on her porch and stared at him. She had no idea what to do with that. He was not a young man, and he was not an old one. She put him somewhere in his early 30s, though the sun had done some work on his face, the kind of honest weathering that came from outdoor labor rather than from neglect. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in at least 3 days, and he was wearing the working clothes of a man who actually worked worn canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, boots that had been resoled at least once. He wore a gun belt, but the flap of it was snapped shut, and he made no move toward it. He just sat in the dust and waited. "Who are you?" Ida called from the porch. "John Wallace," he said. "I have a parcel about 6 miles east along the creek bend. Bought it last autumn, been building on it since." Ida frowned. She had heard about the new homesteader out on the creek bend but had not met him. The territory was still filling up, still settling into itself like sediment after a flood. "What do you want, Mr. Wallace?" "To be honest with you," he said, "I'm not entirely sure how to start that conversation, which is partly why I'm sitting down here instead of coming up and making a speech at you. I've heard you've had some men come calling who weren't especially welcome. I've heard you handled it." "You've heard correctly," Ida said. "I also heard that Gerald Hicks from the Bar M isn't finished with this property," John Wallace said. "And the man who came through on foot 3 weeks ago, I know who he is. His name is Decker. He works for a land speculator out of Kansas City who's been buying up claims in the territory by one means or another, and when buying doesn't work, he uses other means." Ida's hand tightened on the broom handle. "Are you here to warn me?" she said. "Partly," John Wallace said. "Partly I thought you might want to know you have a neighbor who's aware of the situation and who does not have any interest in your land except as it concerns the land being in the possession of someone who rightfully owns it." "And the other part," Ida said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the wheat field. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass beyond the fence. "The other part," he said slowly, as though he was choosing his words with real care, "is that I came by about 3 weeks ago before any of this to introduce myself as a neighbor, which I should have done last autumn and didn't because I was busy building and not thinking about being neighborly. And I turned down your lane, and I saw the man on foot Decker standing in your yard, and I kept riding because I thought maybe it was none of my business and you seemed to be handling it." Ida looked at him. "I've been bothered by that decision since," John Wallace said simply. "I thought I would come and say so." Ida stood on the porch for a long moment. The meadowlark sang again. Clarence the mule made a sound from the barn that was not quite a bray and not quite a complaint, somewhere in between. She went inside. She came back out 2 minutes later with a tin cup of water and walked down the porch steps and down the lane and held it out to him where he sat in the dust. He took it and drank and said thank you, and she stood there and looked at him in the way she had of looking at things, carefully and without particular hurry. "6 miles east," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "What are you building?" "A proper house," he said. "Started with a soddy like most, but I've been cutting timber since February. Got 3 rooms up, working on the 4th. "You're doing it alone?" "Mostly. I hired on a couple of hands for the heavy work when I needed to." He looked up at her. His eyes were a medium gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and there was a quality to them that she noted without entirely meaning to a quality of straightforwardness, of looking at a thing directly rather than sideways. "I'm not a particularly sociable man, Mrs. Collins. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to cause you trouble or to be in your business. But I do think a neighbor who knows what's happening at the Bar M and who knows about Decker is more useful to you than a neighbor who sits 6 miles away pretending he doesn't. Ida considered that. "Have some more water," she said, and went back up to the house to refill the cup. When she came back down, he was still sitting in the dust, which she found she appreciated. She had half expected him to have gotten up and come to the porch in her absence, taking the inch she'd given and stretching it into a yard. He hadn't moved. She handed him the cup and he drank again, and then he set the cup in the dust beside him and looked out at the wheat field. "It's a good field," he said. "What's your yield looking like?" "Better than last year," she said. "The winter was wet enough. I'm hoping for 30 bushels an acre if the summer stays reasonable." He nodded. "The creek's been running well. I've been thinking about irrigation from it, but I haven't worked out the engineering yet." "Thomas had plans for that," Ida said. "He drew them up the last winter." She said it without particular sadness, in the plain way she had come to speak of Thomas, acknowledging him as a real fact of her past rather than a wound she was protecting. John Wallace was quiet for a respectful moment. "He sounds like a man who was thinking ahead," he said. "He was," Ida said. "He was a planner. Better planner than I am. I tend to deal with what's in front of me." "That seems like a reasonable approach, given what's been in front of you." Ida almost smiled. It was not a full smile, she did not quite get there, but something shifted in the line of her mouth, something that had not shifted in some time. "Mr. Wallace," she said. "John is fine," he said. "Mr. Wallace," she said again, firmly but not unkindly, because she was not ready to call him John and she did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. "I want you to be honest with me about something." "I'll try," he said. "Did you come out here today because you feel guilty about riding past my property 3 weeks ago, or because you genuinely think Decker and the Bar M are going to be a continued problem?" He thought about that with a seriousness she found refreshing. Most men, in her experience, answered questions about their motivations immediately, which meant they were answering what they wanted to appear to be true rather than what was actually true. John Wallace sat with the question for a good 15 seconds before he spoke. "Both," he said. "Honestly, both. And also because I think 40 acres of well-worked land with a solid stand of wheat in it, and a woman who chased 3 men off with a broom and a rifle is something worth being a neighbor to." This time she did smile, just slightly, just enough. "You may get up out of the dust," she said. He stood, unfolding himself from the ground with a practical ease, and brushed the dust from the back of his trousers. He was taller than she had assessed from the porch, not enormously so, but solidly built in the way of men who work with their bodies, with a kind of contained physical presence that was not threatening but was not inconsiderable either. He picked up the tin cup and held it out to her. "Thank you for the water," he said. "Thank you for sitting in the dust," she said, and took the cup. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and something passed across his expression that she could not quite name, something that was not quite amusement and not quite something more, a thing in between. "I'll come back," he said, "if that's all right with you, to let you know if I hear anything further about Decker or the Bar M." "That would be all right," Ida said. He climbed back onto the wagon bench and turned the horses and went back up the lane, and Ida stood at the gate and watched him go. Inside the house, she could hear June waking up from her nap, could hear the creak of the small bed and the soft footfalls on the plank floor. Ida looked down at the tin cup in her hand, and then out at the dust of the lane where John Wallace had been sitting, and then she went inside to see about supper. He came back 4 days later, not with news about Decker or the Bar M, but with a half-cord of firewood that he stacked neatly beside the barn without being asked. Ida watched him from the kitchen window for a moment before she went out. "I didn't ask for firewood," she said. "No," he agreed, setting down another piece. "I had extra green timber I cut last month. It needs to season anyway, and my wood pile's already more than I'll need. Seemed wasteful to let it sit." Ida looked at the wood and then at him. "I don't need charity, Mr. Wallace." "It's not charity," he said, straightforward as ever. "It's a neighborly gesture. There's a difference. Charity implies you can't manage. This implies we both can manage better if we look out for each other somewhat." She could not find fault with that logic. June had come out while they were talking, appearing around the corner of the house with the quiet curiosity of a child who had not quite decided whether something was interesting or not. She had Ida's dark brown hair and Thomas's way of looking at things sideways first, assessing, before committing to a direction. "June," Ida said, "this is Mr. Wallace from down the creek." "How do you do?" June said, with the formal politeness Ida had worked hard to instill in her. "I do just fine," John Wallace said, and crouched down to her level in an easy, unself-conscious way. "I heard you have a mule named Clarence." June's face immediately became animated. "He's very stubborn," she said. "Mama says he's the most stubborn creature in the territory except for her." "I've got a horse named Pepper who might give them both a run," John Wallace said seriously. "She won't cross water willingly, has to be convinced every single time." "How do you convince a horse?" June asked. "I go first," he said. "Every time I just go in first and then she follows. Doesn't seem to be about the water, really. She just wants to see that it's all right before she'll trust it." Ida, listening to this, felt something quiet settle somewhere in her chest, a small thing, barely noticeable, like a pebble dropped into still water. She filed it away without examining it. "Do you want coffee?" she said. He looked up at her. "If it's not trouble." "I was making it anyway." They sat on the porch, the three of them, with the late afternoon coming gold across the wheat field, and June sitting on the porch step drawing something in the dirt with a stick, while the adults drank their coffee. Ida learned that John Wallace had come to the territory from Missouri, where he had worked his family's farm after his father's death, until his younger brother was old enough to take it over, and then he had come west with the last of his savings looking for land he could call genuinely his own. "Did you always want to come west?" Ida asked. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I wanted land that felt like mine. In Missouri, the land had my father in it and my grandfather before him. Good memories, but crowded. I wanted somewhere I could start from the beginning." "Did you find it?" He considered the question. "I'm finding it," he said. "It takes longer than you think." Ida knew exactly what he meant. She had felt it too, those first years, the slow process of a place becoming yours through the accumulation of work and seasons and small choices. Thomas's death had changed that feeling, had carved something out of it, but she had been putting it back together, piece by piece, with every morning she got up and went out to see to the animals and the land. "Yes," she said, "it does." The summer moved forward, and John Wallace came by every few days. Sometimes he had a stated reason news from town, a question about the lay of the land near the creek, a sack of flour he had picked up at the general store in Clearwater while he was there. And sometimes he had no stated reason at all and simply sat on the porch steps and talked with Ida about the weather and the crops and the small events of territorial life. She found, to her mild surprise, that she did not mind his company. More than that, she found that she had begun to expect it, to notice on the days he didn't come by that there was a particular quality to the afternoon that was different from when he did. She did not examine that too closely. She was not ready to examine it. What she was more immediately concerned with was the situation with the Bar M, which had not resolved itself as she had hoped it might. In late June, she rode into Clearwater on Clarence, who was, in fact, extraordinarily stubborn about the process of being ridden, to file some papers at the land office. And she ran into old Meredith Crane, who ran the dry goods store and knew more about what was happening in the territory than any newspaper. And Meredith told her that the Bar M had recently taken on a new business partner out of Kansas City. The same Kansas City land speculator that John Wallace had mentioned in connection with Decker. Ida rode home with a tightness in her jaw and did some thinking. John came by that evening with a bucket of early summer tomatoes from his kitchen garden, and she told him what she had heard. He set down the tomatoes and was quiet for a moment. "So Decker and the Bar M are working together now," he said. "That seems to be the shape of it," Ida said. John leaned against the porch rail and looked out at the lane. "What do you want to do about it?" "I want to keep my land," Ida said flatly. "That's the right answer," he said. "The question is how." He thought for a moment. There's a woman in Clearwater, Harriet Foss. Her husband is a lawyer, one of the few in the territory who's actually trained. He handled some claims disputes for folks near the creek last winter. If your deed and claim documentation are in order, having a lawyer look at them and confirm they're ironclad might be a good first step. I can't pay a lawyer, Ida said. The initial consultation might not cost much, worth finding out. Ida looked at him. She had been self-reliant long enough that accepting suggestions from other people, even sensible ones, required a small but real act of will. But John Wallace had a quality she had come to recognize over the past weeks. He offered information and then stopped. He did not push. He did not follow a suggestion with 3 more suggestions until you found yourself agreeing out of sheer exhaustion. He said the thing he thought was worth saying, and then he waited to see what you thought about it. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's fair," he said. They shelled peas on the porch that evening while June practiced her reading aloud from the McGuffey Reader, and the sun went down behind the western hills, and somewhere down the lane, a whip-poor-will started up its relentless, lovely call. "I like this land," John said, not to her particularly, just to the air. "So do I," Ida said. There was a comfort in that, in having someone sit beside her who understood what the land was worth, not in dollars but in the other way, the real way. She went to see Harriet Foss's husband, a neat, serious man named Arthur Foss, the following week. He looked over her deed and claim papers and her land office records and told her they were solid. He also told her something she had not known, that there had been a spate of fraudulent transactions in the territory in the past 2 years, orchestrated by speculators, in which legitimate deeds had been challenged on manufactured technicalities, and that having a lawyer's letter on file attesting to the validity of the claim could serve as a deterrent. Arthur Foss charged her $3 for the letter, which she paid in full, and she rode back to the homestead feeling slightly better about things. The trouble came in July. It came in the form of 2 men on horseback, not Decker and not anyone from the Bar M she recognized, but clearly sent by one or both. They rode into the lane at midday when the sun was at its most unforgiving, and the heat made the air above the wheat field shimmer. June was inside. Ida was in the kitchen garden, kneeling between the bean rows. She heard the horses and stood up and looked at the men and understood immediately that these were not men who had come to negotiate. One of them had a coil of rope hanging from his saddle horn, decorative perhaps, or perhaps not. The other one was speaking, something about trespassing, about her being on land that had been reassigned, about papers that had apparently been filed in her absence, which was a lie, and she knew it was a lie. But a lie delivered by 2 large men on horses has a quality that requires careful management. Ida was wiping her hands on her apron and thinking very fast when she heard the sound of another horse coming up the lane from the road. John Wallace came around the bend on a roan horse. He had sold his wagon horse and bought a proper riding horse in June, and he pulled up at the gate and looked at the 2 men in Ida's yard and then at Ida, and then he dismounted and tied the horse to the fence post and came up the lane in a manner that was entirely calm and entirely unhurried. "Afternoon," he said to the 2 men. Then to Ida, "Mrs. Collins, I heard there might be some confusion about property boundaries out this way. I brought a copy of the survey maps from the land office." He reached into his jacket and produced papers, actual papers, which he held out with the matter-of-fact confidence of a man who was entirely prepared to be questioned about them. This was not what Ida had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it was something louder. The quiet efficiency of what John Wallace was doing was more effective than anything louder would have been. The 2 men looked at the papers. They could not, Ida suspected, read them. But they could read John Wallace's face, which was entirely pleasant and entirely unafraid. "These are filed claims," John said, "registered at the Territorial Land Office in Guthrie in the name of Thomas and Ida Collins, transferred in full to Mrs. Ida Collins upon Mr. Collins's death in February of 1882. There's also a letter here from Arthur Foss, attorney at law in Clearwater, attesting to the validity and uncontested status of the claim." One of the men said something low and unpleasant. John Wallace looked at him with an expression that did not change at all. "You're welcome to take issue with legal documentation," he said. "You would need to do that through the land office. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss, or were you planning to be on your way?" There was a long pause. The heat pressed down. A hawk circled somewhere overhead, and the bean rose stood green and patient in the garden behind Ida. The men left. Ida stood in her garden and watched them go, and then looked at John Wallace, who was folding the papers back into his jacket pocket. "You had those papers on you," she said. "I went to the land office last week and got copies," he said. "Seemed like a reasonable precaution." Ida looked at him for a moment. The sun was very bright. Her heart was still moving somewhat faster than its resting pace. She was aware of a number of things simultaneously: the heat and the light and the smell of the bean plants and the particular silence that comes after a threat passes, and also the fact that John Wallace had, quietly and without announcement, done a careful and useful thing on her behalf. "Thank you," she said. The words came out straightforwardly because she meant them straightforwardly. "You do the same," he said, which was such a simple and sensible thing to say that she almost laughed. "Come inside," she said. "It's too hot to stand in the sun." They sat in the kitchen, and Ida poured buttermilk, and June came out of the back room where she had been very quiet during the altercation in the yard, and the three of them sat at the table, and Ida felt not safe exactly, because she knew the situation with the Bar M was not resolved, but something adjacent to safe. Something that had to do not just with the papers in John Wallace's pocket, but with the fact of him being there, the simple, unglamorous fact of it. "They'll come back," Ida said. "Maybe," John said, "or they'll find it's not worth the trouble." "You think they'll decide it's not worth the trouble?" "I think," he said carefully, "that people like that look for the easiest path. If we make this path difficult enough, they move on to a different one. And if we don't," he met her eyes, "then we keep making it difficult." That word "we" sat in the kitchen air between them. Ida noticed it. She thought he might have noticed her noticing it because something moved briefly in his expression. But neither of them addressed it, and then June asked if she could have more buttermilk, and the moment passed into the ordinary afternoon. August came with a particular ferocity. The kind of August the Oklahoma Territory was capable of, dry and merciless, that cracked the soil into a patchwork of pale lines and made the air taste of dust and heat. Ida's wheat had been harvested in late July, a good yield, better than she had hoped, and she had gotten a fair price for it at the grain elevator in Clearwater, enough to carry her through winter comfortably and pay ahead on her taxes. The threat from the Bar M had quieted, though it had not disappeared. Gerald Hicks had come by once more in late July, this time with a more measured offer and a noticeably less confrontational manner, and Ida had declined with equal politeness, and he had gone without further argument. She thought about what John had said, making the path difficult. She suspected that Arthur Foss's letter and the presence of properly filed copies of her deed at the land office had done some of the work. She also suspected that the fact that she was known not to be entirely alone in the matter had done some of it too. On a hot afternoon in the middle of August, John came by and Ida was sitting on the porch with her mending, which was the work she liked least and put off the longest and always eventually had to face. June was at a neighbor's farm 3 miles north, spending the night with the Hendricks girl, who was also 8, and with whom June had formed the serious and exclusive friendship that children form when they find another child who shares their particular constellation of interests. Ida was alone and aware of being alone, and when John's horse appeared at the end of the lane she felt something shift in her, a small but definite settling, like a lock finding its groove. She watched him come up the lane and tie Pepper to the porch post and take off his hat and look at her. "I brought peaches," he said. He held up a small wooden crate. "The mercantile in Clearwater got a shipment in from a grower in Texas. They're good." Ida set down the shirt she was mending. "Peaches." "I bought too many," he said, which was clearly not true, but she had learned that this was one of the few ways in which John Wallace was less than entirely straightforward. He occasionally manufactured excesses as a reason to share things, rather than simply saying he wanted to share them. "Come sit down," she said. He set the crate on the porch step, and they sat and ate peaches in the way you eat peaches in August heat, without much ceremony, letting the juice run where it wanted. The territory stretched out around them in its vast summer afternoon, the pale gold of the harvested wheat field and the deep green of the kitchen garden and the blue line of the hills on the horizon, and above everything the enormous sky, the Oklahoma sky that still, even now, could stop Ida in the middle of a task and make her look up. "John," she said. It was the first time she had called him that. She heard herself do it and did not pull it back. He looked at her. Something in his expression had gone very quiet, the way it got sometimes when he was listening carefully. "Why are you not married?" she said. She had been wondering this for some time and had been choosing her moment. He was quiet for a moment. He turned a peach pit over in his fingers. "I was once," he said. "Before Missouri, we were young. She died in childbirth. The child, too." Ida said nothing for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it fully. "It was a long time ago," he said. Not dismissing it. She could see it was not dismissed, but placing it in the past where it lived, in the way that people learn to do with grief when they have no choice but to keep going. "After that I was not in a condition to be thinking about anyone else for a long while. And then I was working and building and there wasn't much room." "And now," Ida said. He looked at her then and she looked at him, and the afternoon sat around them warm and very still. "Now," he said, "there seems to be some room." The directness of that, the plain, unhurried directness that was entirely characteristic of him, landed in her chest like something she had not known was missing. She had been a wife. She had loved Thomas in the complicated, complete way of people who build a life together, who know each other's irritating habits as well as their qualities. She had mourned him and continued to mourn him in the way that real loss continues, not as a constant sharp thing but as an absence, a shape in the world where something used to be. She had not expected to feel anything new. "I am a widow with 40 acres and a stubborn mule and a daughter who will ask you 40 questions about horses before you have your boots off," she said. "My life is not straightforward." "Mine either," he said. "I'm serious," she said, though she was not, she realized, entirely unhappy about the direction of this conversation. "I have fought 3 men off my land with a broom this year. I am not a simple situation." "Ida," he said, also the first time he had used her given name, and it fit in his voice the way a word fits when it belongs there. "I came and sat in the dust at your gate. I have never once thought you were a simple situation." She looked at him for a long time. The peach juice was drying sticky on her fingers, and the whippoorwill was starting up somewhere in the grass, and the light was going gold and soft, and there was something in John Wallace's face that she found she could look at without looking away. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like you to keep coming by." "I plan to," he said, simply, like a fact. Something opened in Ida Collins that had been very carefully closed for 14 months. Not all the way. She was too practical for all the way at once, but enough. Enough to feel the evening air on her face and be glad of the company beside her, and not tell herself she was only imagining that it mattered. The territory moved into autumn, and Ida and John moved into something that neither of them named for some time, with the mutual, unspoken agreement of people who have both been burned by loss and understand that some things are better approached slowly and on their own terms. He came by often enough that June stopped noticing it as an event and began accepting it as a feature of the days, the way children accept things that become regular without attaching particular significance to them. She showed him Thomas's irrigation drawings, the ones Ida had mentioned in their first real conversation, and John spread them out on the kitchen table and looked at them with real interest. "He was clever," John said. "Look at how he's rooted it from the high point of the creek. This would work." "Do you think so?" Ida said. She was standing beside him looking at the drawings, close enough that she could see the detail of his hands on the paper, broad, capable hands, scarred across the knuckles in the way of men who work with tools. "This gradient here," he said, tracing it with one finger, "would give you gravity flow as far as the kitchen garden, maybe further with a little modification. Thomas never had the time to build it, Ida said. I could help you build it, John said. This winter when things are slower. It would be ready by spring planting. She looked at the drawings and then at him. That's a considerable amount of work. I know what I'm offering, he said. She believed him. September brought the first real coolness to the mornings, and with it, a kind of clarity that Ida always associated with autumn in the territory. The sense of things settling into their true forms after the blurred excess of summer heat. The trouble with the Bar M had receded further. She had heard through Meredith Crane that the Kansas City speculator had shifted his attention to a cluster of claims further north, and while Gerald Hicks still worked the ranch, he had not come back to her gate. Decker's name had not come up in some weeks. Ida allowed herself to breathe slightly easier on that front, though she kept her Remington rifle clean and her documentation in order and her independence intact. She was not a woman who waited for circumstances to resolve themselves permanently before she considered them resolved. She was a woman who maintained vigilance as a permanent condition of life and considered that entirely reasonable. On a Saturday in late September, John came by in the afternoon, and they walked the fence line together. There was a section of it that needed attention, and they had talked about restringing it. June came with them, running ahead and coming back like a dog that has somewhere to be and also nowhere to be, simultaneous. The grass was starting to turn, going from summer green to the pale gold that would be its winter color, and the sky had that particular autumn clarity, blue going all the way to the edge of the world. They worked on the fence together, John doing the heavier work of driving the new posts while Ida handled the wire, which she was efficient at. Thomas had taught her early in the first season, when there was no one else to help. June handed them tools with a seriousness that was very like her mother's. When the fence was done, John said, "I need to tell you something." Ida straightened and looked at him. He had a way of saying things like that, prefacing them, giving her the shape of the information before the information itself, that she had come to appreciate. It was considerate in a practical rather than a sentimental way. "Tell me," she said. "I want to see Arthur Foss on Monday," he said. "About something different. About what happens legally if two adjacent landowners were to consolidate their holdings." He looked at her steadily. "I wasn't asking on anyone's behalf. I was asking to understand the process. I want to be clear about that." Ida held the wire cutters in her hand and looked at him. "I'm not asking you to consolidate anything," John said. "I'm telling you I want to find out how it would work because—" He stopped. He looked at the fence post he had just driven. "Because I wanted to know, in case it was ever something worth knowing." "John," Ida said. He looked at her. "You are the least roundabout man I have ever met," she said, "and you are currently being extraordinarily roundabout." Something shifted in his expression, that thing that was not quite amusement and sometimes was more than that. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I am." "Say what you mean," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "I would like to marry you, Ida. Not now if you're not ready. Not on any particular schedule. But I want you to know that that is what I'm thinking about, and I thought you should know it because you deserve to know where someone stands." June, who had been crouching in the grass examining something at the base of the fence post, stood up and looked at both of them with the expression of a child who has heard something significant and is processing it. Ida set down the wire cutters. The grass moved around them in a light wind that smelled of autumn and distance. She thought about the past 14 months. She thought about the shape of life as it had been, the hard, competent, exhausting shape of it. And she thought about the past 3 months, and the way they had been different. Not easier exactly, but fuller, in the particular way of a day that has good conversation in it versus a day that does not. She thought about sitting on the porch with Peaches and the whippoorwill. She thought about the irrigation drawing spread on the kitchen table and his hands on the paper. She thought about him sitting in the dust at her gate, and how she had not known what to do with that. She thought she had known even then that he was something she had not encountered before and would not easily put away. "I am not a woman who does things quickly," she said. "I know that," he said. "I have a daughter who is 8 years old and who has opinions about everything." "I know that too. I like her opinions." Ida looked at June, who was still watching them with bright, serious eyes. "June," she said, "what do you think?" June thought about this with the careful gravity she brought to serious questions. "I think," she said, "that Mr. Wallace knows that Pepper has to be gone in first and that Clarence is stubborn, and he still comes over all the time, so he probably means it." John Wallace looked at June with what appeared to be genuine respect. Ida looked at the fence line stretching away into the autumn gold grass, and at the homestead with its solid roof, and its kitchen garden and the cottonwood in the east corner, and at the man standing beside her who had sat in the dust at her gate and waited and come back and been steady without being asked to be steady, and she made a decision. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "When the irrigation is built and we've spent a winter being honest with each other." "All right," he said, and then, because he was John Wallace, "Is the answer likely to be yes?" She picked up the wire cutters. "The answer," she said, "is likely to be yes." The winter they built the irrigation channel was one of the better winters Ida could remember, which was not a statement about the weather. The weather was harsh, as winters in the Oklahoma Territory had a right to be, with bitter nights and wind that came off the plains like something with a personal grievance. It was a better winter for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the texture of the days. John came by when the weather permitted, which was not every day but was often enough. They worked on Thomas's irrigation plans on the kitchen table, refining them, figuring out the practical details of excavation and pipe fitting, and the particular challenges of their section of the creek. June learned to play checkers and beat John at it with a regularity that he seemed genuinely unbothered by, and he taught her a card game he had learned in Missouri called pitch, which she learned with alarming speed. They talked, Ida and John, the way people talk when they are deciding whether they trust each other with the truth of themselves. It was not always comfortable. There were things Ida said that were difficult to say about Thomas, about the long months after his death, about the particular terror she had felt on the night after the third man came to her gate, and she sat on the kitchen floor with the rifle. John listened the way he did everything with his full attention and without trying to fix it. And he told her things too. About the wife he had lost when he was 23, whose name had been Clara, and how he had managed that loss by working until he could not think, which was both the worst and the only way he knew. About the years in Missouri, the gradual settling, and then the decision to come west, which had felt like the first real decision he had made entirely for himself in a decade. "Were you happy in Missouri?" Ida asked one evening. "I was functional," he said. "There's a difference." She understood that entirely. The irrigation work began in March when the ground had softened enough to dig. They worked on it together, with June helping where she could and finding her own ways to be useful. And it took 3 weeks of weekend labor and 2 full days when the channel reached the critical section near the creek, and John came and stayed from before dawn until after dark. When the water ran through for the first time, through the channel they had dug and lined and graded with Thomas's plans as the guide, Ida stood and watched it and felt something she had not expected, something like completion, like a promise being kept. Not to Thomas exactly, though there was that, but to the land itself and to herself. "It works," she said. "It works," John agreed, standing beside her. She took his hand. Just his hand, and held it for a moment, and he let her. And they stood there in the March light watching the water run clean through the channel toward the garden. She let go before June, who was watching from the bank, could decide whether or not to have opinions about it. April came, and the planting, and the land turning green again in the particular miraculous way it did every year. And on an evening in the middle of April, when the kitchen smelled of the salt pork and cornbread Ida had made for supper, and John was sitting across the table from her and June had gone to bed, he said it again, not with the same careful preamble as before, simply and directly. "Will you marry me, Ida?" She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw warm light across his face, and he looked at her steadily with those gray-green eyes. "Yes," she said. "I will." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his and he held it with the same steadiness with which he did everything. And Ida Collins felt not rescued. She would never in her life feel rescued because she did not require rescuing but accompanied. Finally, genuinely, thoroughly accompanied. They were married in June, a year and 2 months after he had first sat down in the dust at her gate. The ceremony was performed by the minister from the church in Clearwater, a quiet man named Reverend Booth, who had married a number of settlers in the territory, and understood that the ceremonies out here were often conducted in places other than churches, in barns, in kitchens, in yards, in places where people's actual lives happened. They stood in Ida's yard, which was also now John's yard, under the open sky, with June beside them in a blue calico dress that Meredith Crane had helped Ida make, and with old Harriet Foss and Arthur Foss in attendance, and with the Hendricks family who had driven over from their farm 3 miles north. Clarence the mule watched from over the fence with magnificent disinterest. Pepper, tied to the post near the barn, watched with somewhat more curiosity. Reverend Booth read the words and they said them back, and when John put the simple gold ring on Ida's finger, he had gotten it at the jeweler in Guthrie, had ridden all the way there and back in a day to get it. His hands were steady, and hers were too. June, when asked later how she felt about having a stepfather, said that she had known it was going to happen since the peach afternoon, which she remembered very clearly, and that she thought it was reasonable and she was glad about it, which was June's version of enthusiastic approval. They celebrated with a supper that Harriet Foss had organized and that several of the neighboring women had contributed to, and there was a fiddle player who materialized from somewhere and played until the stars were well out, and Ida danced, which she had not done in years, first with June and then with John, who was not a graceful dancer but was an honest one, keeping time without pretending to be more than he was. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and June was asleep and the yard was quiet, they stood together on the porch and looked at the land. 40 acres, John said. 40 acres, Ida agreed, and 6 miles east. We should talk about the arrangement, formally. What we do with both parcels. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he agreed. She leaned against him, which was a thing she had not done with another person in a very long time, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in the warm June night with the land around them going dark and still. The arrangement they worked out was this. John's 6-mile parcel was good for grazing, and Ida's 40 acres was better for crops, and together they had something more versatile and sustainable than either alone. John moved his building operation to Ida's property, their property, and they expanded the house through the autumn, adding 2 rooms with timber he had been cutting and seasoning since winter. The house that had been a 2-room house became a 4-room house, solid and well-made, with a front porch that ran the length of it and a back porch that looked out toward the creek. The Bar M made one more approach, in late summer, this time through a formal letter from a lawyer. Arthur Foss responded on their behalf, and that was the last of it. The Kansas City speculator had moved his operation north, and the Bar M had changed its expansion plans. The letter from Arthur Foss was thorough and unambiguous, and clearly indicated that the Collins-Wallace claim was not a productive avenue for anyone who had better options. Decker's name did not come up again. In the spring of the 2nd year of their marriage, Ida became certain she was pregnant, which she communicated to John on a Tuesday morning over coffee with the same plainness with which she communicated most things. "I think we're going to have a child," she said. John set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and what crossed his face was something she had not expected, a complexity of emotion that he did not try to hide, which included joy and also something shadowed, something that was the ghost of Clara and what had happened when he was 23. Ida saw all of that and reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I know," she said. "I know what you're thinking about." "I'm thinking about being happy," he said, steadily, choosing it. "I'm thinking about being happy." She saw him choose it, saw the deliberate act of it, and loved him for it in the practical, complete, unglamorous way she had come to love him, with her eyes open, seeing him whole. "Good," she said. "Me too." The autumn of 1885 brought them a son. He was born at the homestead on a cool October morning, delivered by a midwife named Mrs. Stout, who drove 4 miles through a light rain to be there, and who was unruffled and competent, and who Ida liked immediately. The birth was long but not complicated, and when it was over, Ida was exhausted in the clean, complete way of a body that has done an enormous thing and succeeded at it. John was there throughout, pacing the front room while Mrs. Stout worked, and when the midwife brought him in, he held his son, their son, with the careful hands of a man holding something he had been afraid to hope for, and Ida watched his face and saw the shadow finally lift from it, completely and for the last time. "He's healthy," Mrs. Stout said with professional satisfaction. "Good strong lungs." This was demonstrated immediately. "He sounds like Clarence," June said from the doorway, which was factually accurate. They named him Thomas John Wallace Thomas for Ida's first husband, whom she would always honor, and John for his father, and Wallace for the name they now all shared. He was called Tom. June took her role as older sister with great seriousness and a fair amount of bossiness, which Tom appeared to find entirely acceptable from his earliest days, demonstrating a placid temperament that he had apparently gotten directly from his father. The homestead flourished. The irrigation channel Thomas Collins had planned and John Wallace had helped Ida build proved its worth every summer, and the kitchen garden expanded, and the wheat field yielded well, and the grazing land on John's parcel to the east supported a small herd of cattle that they had purchased with careful planning, 12 head to start, growing slowly as the land supported it. John broke the 6 miles of riding back and forth by tying a good fence line between the two parcels and maintaining them as one extended operation, which made practical sense, and which Ida's common sense embraced entirely. In the summer of 1887, Ida and John sat on the front porch on a warm evening while Tom, who was nearly 2 and had recently discovered the profound delight of running, ran in circles in the yard in the manner of a small person who has just learned what legs are for. June, who was 11 and beginning to have the opinions of someone considerably older, was reading on the porch steps. The land was green and the sky was evening blue and the creek could be heard faintly in the distance. "Do you think about what it would have been like," John said, "if things had gone differently, with the Bar M or Decker?" Ida thought about it. "Sometimes," she said, "not with fear, more with gratitude." "Gratitude for what?" "That they failed," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment, watching Tom investigate something near the fence post with intense scientific interest. "I think about sitting at your gate," he said. "In the dust," she said. "In the dust," he said, "and being afraid you were going to come down that lane and send me off with the broom like the others." Ida looked at him. "Were you afraid?" "Not of the broom," he said. "I was afraid you would have good reason to." She understood what he meant. He had been afraid she was right to keep everyone out. He had been afraid that his wanting to sit down at her gate and stay was not a good enough argument against a woman's very legitimate reasons for not wanting anyone there at all. "You sat down," she said. "I sat down," he said. It seemed like the only honest thing to do. Tom, from the yard, made a sound that indicated he had found something interesting, and that the interesting thing was currently being put in his mouth. "Tom," Ida said, without raising her voice significantly. "No." Tom put the interesting thing down with an expression of philosophical acceptance. John made a sound beside her that was definitely a laugh. "He gets that from you," Ida said. "That acceptance." "He gets his stubbornness from his mother," John said. She did not argue with that because it was accurate. June looked up from her book. "Mama," she said, "when I grow up, I want 40 acres of my own." Ida looked at her daughter, this serious, clever, strong-headed girl who had watched her mother fight for land and win it and keep it and make it better, and felt something that went all the way through her. "Then you'll have 40 acres of your own," she said, "and more if you want them." June nodded with satisfaction and went back to her book. By 1889, when Oklahoma itself was making its way toward proper statehood, and the land runs were bringing enormous numbers of new settlers into the territory in the great chaotic rush of April that year, Ida and John Wallace's homestead was one of the most established in their section. A working, productive place with a solid house and a good barn and fields that had been worked and improved for nearly a decade. Tom was 4 and had Ida's brown eyes and John's disposition, and a complete inability to be still for more than 8 consecutive minutes. June was 13 and already helping with the books, which she had a talent for that surpassed either of her parents, and was also, quietly and with great purpose, teaching herself to survey land using a book she had borrowed from Arthur Foss's office and not yet returned. In that same year, Ida became pregnant again, which she discovered in the hot July of that enormous transitional year, and communicated to John at the kitchen table in the same matter-of-fact way as before. This time his face went directly to joy, without the shadow, without the hesitation, joy and a hand across the table, and a smile that she had come to know as one of her most reliable resources. The baby came in March of 1890, with the same midwife and the same cool efficiency and a considerably shorter labor. And she was a girl, a dark-haired, apparently opinionated girl, who announced her presence in the world with a volume that impressed even Mrs. Stout. They named her Clara, which had been the name in John's past that Ida knew he carried with both grief and tenderness, and she suggested it herself because she was Ida Collins Wallace and she did not do things halfway or with eyes averted from the things that mattered. When she said the name, John looked at her for a long moment. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am," she said. "She deserves a name with meaning, and so does the name." He nodded, and there was something in the nod that settled a thing that had been unsettled for a very long time. Clara Wallace was, from the very beginning, an entity of great personal conviction. She had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's jaw, and an expression of focused determination that June said, with the authority of a 14-year-old who considers herself observational, was the most frightening thing she had ever seen on a baby. Tom was an attentive and baffled older brother, frequently brought items to show the baby, and was genuinely wounded that the baby did not immediately appreciate them. The house in 1890 was full in the way that a house is full when it is working the way a house is supposed to work with noise and meals, and the ordinary crisis of lost boots and mended harnesses and seeds that needed sorting and accounts that needed tending, and the perpetual question of whether Clarence the mule, who was now very old and very stubborn and somewhat imperious about it, was ever going to cooperate with anything anyone asked of him ever again. He was not, mostly. But he continued to be present and alive, which Ida found she respected. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, in June of 1892, Ida and John sat on the front porch after supper while the 3 children, June, now 16 and long past needing the porch steps to read, had gone inside to do her letters, and Tom was in the barn making friends with a new calf, and Clara was asleep in the back room in the emphatic, absolute way she slept when she was finally persuaded to do so. The evening was the kind that the Oklahoma Territory was capable of making in June, when everything went golden and the air smelled of grass and coming rain, and the sky turned colors that had no exact names. They had a second lamp on the porch this summer because John had brought it out sometime in May and Ida had not moved it back. 6 years, Ida said. 6 years, John said. He looked at his hands, then at the yard, then at her. "Are you happy, Ida?" She considered the question in the way she considered everything fully without rushing it, letting it be the size it actually was. "I am," she said. "I am very happy. Are you?" "Extraordinarily," he said, which was not a word she had heard him use before and which made her smile. She looked out at the land. 40 acres of her own and 6 miles east, and what they had made between them. The children and the fields and the house with its 4 rooms, and the creek running through the channel that Thomas had planned and John had helped build, and that had watered the garden every summer for 7 years. She thought about the woman she had been when Chet Barlow had ridden up the lane on his well-kept roan horse and told her about interested parties from Kansas. She thought about standing on the porch with the broom in her hand and the absolute certainty that she was not going to give up 1 inch of what was hers. She thought about the morning she had sat on the kitchen floor with the rifle on her knees and told herself she was managing. She had been managing. She had been right about that. But she had also been alone in the way that has nothing to do with whether other people are present and everything to do with whether the person beside you can see the same horizon you can see. John Wallace saw the same horizon. She turned to him and found him looking at her with the same expression he had been wearing since approximately the afternoon she brought him a cup of water at her gate, that expression that was direct and unhurried and entirely without pretense, that had been saying the same thing for 6 years without requiring words. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "When you sat down in the dust at my gate," she said, "I genuinely did not know what to do with that. I had sent 3 men away, and I had my broom, and I had made my peace with being on my own. And then you sat down in the dust and looked at the land instead of at me, and I had no preparation for any of it." "I know," he said. "I could see that." "What I could not see," she said, "not then was that it was the only way you could have arrived that would have worked. Anyone else would have come with an offer or an argument or a smile, and I would have known what to do. You sat down and I didn't, and that was," she paused, choosing it right, "that was how I knew." He was quiet for a moment. The evening was going from gold to rose. Somewhere in the grass the whippoorwill was calling. "Knew what?" he said. "That you were worth the trouble," she said. He laughed a real laugh, full and warm and entirely unguarded, which she had worked for long enough that she considered it one of the genuine achievements of her life. "Ida Collins Wallace," he said. "John Wallace," she said. He took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together on the porch while the Oklahoma Territory put on its evening colors around them. The gold and the rose and the deepening blue, and the first stars coming out above the dark line of the hills, and the house behind them breathed with the sound of 3 children sleeping, and 1 mule being stubborn in the barn, and 1 mare waiting patiently by the water trough, and the whole of a life that had been built out of 40 acres and hard winters and stubbornness, and a man who had known, at exactly the right moment, to sit down in the dust. The years that followed settled into a rhythm that Ida had learned not to take for granted, because she knew better than most that the ground beneath a good life was only as solid as you kept tending it. She and John kept tending it. June grew into a remarkable young woman, tall and sharp-eyed, and possessed of a competence that made grown men occasionally look slightly uncertain about themselves, which Ida considered a fine quality in a daughter. By the time she was 18, she was managing a full set of accounts for 3 neighboring farms, and had surveyed 2 land disputes with enough accuracy that Arthur Foss, now approaching his late years and thinking about succession, had begun teaching her formal law in the evenings. She married at 21, a young schoolteacher named Frank Dale, who had come to the Territory from Ohio, and who had the good sense to understand that June was the smartest person in any room, and to be genuinely glad about it rather than threatened. Tom grew tall and brown and quiet, his father's practical intelligence combined with his mother's capacity for absolute determination, and he took to farming with the same wholehearted commitment that both his parents had always brought to it. By the time he was 12, he was genuinely useful in ways that were not merely about keeping a boy occupied, and by 14, he could assess the condition of a wheat field or a stretch of fence line with an accuracy that made John nod with the particular satisfaction of a man who sees what he was hoping for taking shape. Clara was her own country entirely. She had, as June had observed in infancy, an expression of focused determination that never really went anywhere. She learned to read before she was 4 and then promptly decided that reading was insufficient and she also needed to learn arithmetic, And by the time she was 6, she had moved on to making improvements to the irrigation channel on her own initiative, a project that she discussed with John with the earnestness of a professional colleague, and that he discussed back with equivalent seriousness. And the improvements were, in fact, quite good. "She frightens me a little," John told Ida one evening, not unkindly. "She's 6, Ida said. "Yes," he said, "exactly." The summer Tom turned 14 and Clara turned 9. The territory had become Oklahoma proper, working its way toward formal statehood which would come in 1907, and the homestead sat in the middle of a settled and increasingly organized landscape, with a proper road now running past the gate where John had once sat in the dust, and a post box where there had once been only the fence post, and neighbors on 3 sides where there had once been primarily distance. Meredith Crane had retired from the dry goods store, and her niece ran it now. Arthur Foss had passed away the previous winter, and June, true to the long education he had given her, was working with the new lawyer in Clearwater on matters of land and claim, and the continuing negotiation of rights and titles in a territory that was still figuring out its own legal shape. Gerald Hicks no longer worked for the Bar M. The Bar M itself had changed hands twice, and was now a considerably smaller operation run by a family from Texas who had no interest in anyone else's 40 acres. Ida thought about this sometimes, about how much of what had felt enormous and permanent in 1883 had shifted and rearranged itself by 1894. How the threats that had felt like the defining features of those early years had receded into the past, while the things that had mattered, the land, the house, the people, had remained and grown. In the autumn of 1895, Ida sat at the kitchen table on a morning when the first frost had silvered the window glass, and Tom was doing the early chores, and Clara was at the table beside her working on her arithmetic, with a ferocity that was only slightly diminished by breakfast. John came in from the barn with cold air following him and pulled off his jacket and hung it on the hook and poured himself coffee and came to sit across the table. He looked at Clara's arithmetic. "The third column," he said. Clara looked at it. "Oh," she said. She corrected it. "Thank you, Papa." He caught Ida's eye across the table and she caught his, and between them was the wordless understanding of two people who have been through enough together that some things no longer need to be translated. The morning light through the frost-silvered window made the kitchen gold, and the coffee was hot, and outside the land lay in its early winter state, harvested and resting, ready for the cycle to begin again. In the evening of that same day, after Clara was in bed and Tom was reading by the lamp in the parlor, Ida and John sat at the kitchen table again with the account spread between them, which was a thing they did at the end of each season, adding up what had come in and what had gone out and what remained and what the next year would need. The numbers were good. They were better than good. The herd had increased to 40 head of cattle and the wheat yield had been strong, and the kitchen garden had been so productive that Ida had been selling the excess at the Clearwater market, and had done well enough at it that they were discussing, very seriously, whether to expand the garden operation into something more formal. "We could hire a hand for the summer," John said. "Between the cattle and the expanded garden and the wheat, it's getting to be more than the two of us can manage well." "Tom is old enough to take a real share of it," Ida said. "He is," John agreed. "But he should also go to school. He should have that choice the way June had it." Ida put down her pencil. This was one of the things she loved most about John Wallace, that he had never, not once, treated June's education or her future as separate from or less important than anything else. He had driven June to the schoolhouse in Clearwater and later to the law office, and he had sat at this same table and discussed her prospects with the same seriousness he brought to cattle numbers and crop yields. "A hand for the summer," she said. "We can afford it." "We can," he agreed. She looked at the numbers on the table and then at him. "John," she said, "do you ever think about how different it could have been?" "From what starting point?" he said. "From any of them," she said. "From the beginning. If I had sold the land, if Decker had succeeded, if," she paused, If you hadn't sat down, he was quiet for a moment. The lamp threw warm light across his face. I think, he said, that you would have managed. You were always going to manage, Ida. That was never the question. What was the question? He looked at her steadily. Whether managing was going to be enough. She held that for a moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwood in the east corner. The same cottonwood they had planted in the first spring, that stood over Thomas Collins's marker, that June had played under as a small girl, and that Tom now climbed with a competence that gave Ida genuine anxiety. The cottonwood was old now, substantial, with the presence of a thing that has been in a place for a long time. It wasn't, she said, going to be enough. No, he said, it wasn't. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, as she had done on the morning she told him about Tom, and he turned his hand and held hers. Thank you for sitting in the dust, she said. He smiled, that warm, full smile that she had worked for and won. Thank you for bringing me a cup of water, he said. The accounts could wait. The lamp could burn a little longer. Outside, the Oklahoma Territory lay under its October sky. The land that was theirs, all of it. Every acre of it. Every fence line and every field and every channel of water running where Thomas Collins had planned it and John Wallace had helped build it. And inside the kitchen of the house they had made from 2 into 4 rooms. Ida Collins Wallace and John Wallace sat at the table together and were, in the most complete and ordinary and extraordinary sense of the word, home. The years that remained to them on that land were good years. Not uncomplicated. No years are uncomplicated, and life in the Oklahoma Territory continued to make its demands, with dry summers that tested the irrigation and markets that moved and children who grew up and went their own ways and came back and went their own ways again. But they were good years, threaded through with the solid, daily substance of a life built on honest work and honest feeling. Tom eventually took over the primary farming operation, and he did it with the gravity and competence Ida had always seen in him. And he brought home a wife when he was 23, a practical, warm-natured young woman named Ellen, who had been raised on a farm 2 counties over, and who could identify a sick head of cattle at 40 paces, and also made an exceptional apple cake, and who fit into the household the way things fit when they belong there. Clara, at 16, announced that she intended to become an engineer. John, without missing a beat, asked her what kind. She said hydraulic engineering, with a particular interest in irrigation and water management, and she cited, with calm specificity, the irrigation channel at the east end of their property as the thing that had initially interested her. And John looked at Ida across the dinner table, and Ida looked at John, and it was one of the moments that required nothing to be said. Clara did, in fact, become an engineer. It required considerable persistence and navigation of institutions that were not designed with her in mind, but she had her mother's stubbornness and her father's patience, and the combination was, it turned out, more than sufficient. June and Frank Dale had 3 children and a house in Clearwater, and June's legal work expanded year by year until she was the most respected land rights attorney in the territory, which she had always been heading toward, and which she achieved without particularly making a fuss about it. And Ida and John remained on the homestead, the 2 of them, through the seasons and the changes and the arrivals and the departures that make up a life well and fully lived. On a June evening some years after Clara had left for her studies, and Tom and Ellen had made the homestead their primary domain, Ida and John sat on the front porch in the familiar way, the 2 lamps still out there, because they had always kept 2 since that summer, and the evening was going gold around them in the particular June way, and the meadowlark was singing in the grass beyond the fence, and somewhere down the lane the creek could be heard over the sound of the warm wind. John had gone gray at his temples in a way that suited him, and Ida had lines at the corners of her eyes from 40 years of sun and squinting at fields and laughing more than she had expected to laugh in the early hard years. They were not young people. They were people who had spent a long time living, and it showed in the way that things show when you are not ashamed of them. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" John said. "Tell me," Ida said. "The first time you smiled at me," he said. "That first day at the gate, it was just barely a smile. You didn't quite get all the way there." Ida thought about it. "You told me you came because you felt guilty about riding past when Decker was in my yard, and because I thought you were worth being a neighbor to," he said. "Yes," she said. "That was the part that almost got me to a full smile." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she looked back at him, and between them was the long accumulated knowledge of two people who have seen each other through every season of a life. The frightening seasons and the flourishing ones, the grief and the joy and the ordinary Tuesday mornings that are the actual substance of everything. The meadowlark sang, and the creek ran through the channel, and the cottonwood in the east corner held its ground as it had always held it, and the land lay around them in the evening light, theirs in the way that very few things are truly anyone's, not owned exactly, but belonging, the land and the people, to each other. Ida Collins Wallace reached over and took her husband's hand. He held it. The evening settled into dark, and the stars came out over the Oklahoma territory, and the lamp on the porch burned, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.